Anyway, some basic principles in this video, just some basic do's and don'ts for the opening that should, let's say, let you get to a middle game pretty safely as a beginner. And, you know, so we don't need to learn millions of variations like professional players, like grandmasters know, but just some guidelines. So here we go. So what's the objective of the opening? So to get your pieces into play, and usually to get castled, more often than not to get castled, the odd exception here and there, but generally speaking is to get yourself castled. It's been said that the opening is complete either once you've castled or once your rooks are connected. So if you've castled and your two rooks can protect each other along your back rank, then you've probably completed the opening. As white, you do have the advantage of an extra move. And I'll look very briefly, we'll look at an opening database at the end of this video, just so you can see that there is a slight advantage in chess to being white. Certainly it's the stronger the players involved, the more that advantage matters. Amongst beginners, it really doesn't make a lot of difference at all. But the stronger you get, the more that advantage does make a bit of a difference. So white's plan really is just to take advantage of that extra move. Black is trying to get developed as quickly as possible, and if they possibly can, win back that tempo. So it's the aim of equalizing. So, okay, let's have a look. So these diagrams show bad openings and good openings. Okay, so in this one, black has definitely come out better from the opening. There's no advantage in pieces or material for either player, but you can see that black controls the center of the board and has much more room to move. The white knights at the side of the board are not ideal. They haven't really got many moves. Actually, if it's white to move, knight g5 is probably going to be the best move, just to put some pressure on that bishop. But basically, that's an advantage to black there. Slight advantage. I'm not saying the game's over, but you'd definitely rather be black from that position. This one is a bit different. You can see this time it's white that's developed quite nicely, controls the center, is castled, whereas the player with the black pieces has done what beginners often try to do, which is create nice, pretty patterns. So all those pawns have nudged forward one square, and so have each of the back rank pieces nudged forward a square, but definitely you'd rather be white there. Again, I'm not saying that the game is absolutely over. There's clearly work to be done, but yeah, it's an odd opening from black, and white would stand better there. And this one, we'll touch on this later on, but this is where black has neglected the diagonal of death and has been checkmated on the third move, which is as quick as white can actually win a game, is on white's third move. Okay, so some general principles to go by for beginners. And to be honest, even if you're not a beginner, if you follow these guidelines, you're not going to go far wrong in the opening. So first of all, one or both of your D, E pawns early. This will release your bishops and it will give you some control, at least some presence in the center of the board. So if you move your E pawn forward, it will allow the bishop and the queen to get out. If you move the D pawn forward, it allows the other bishop to get out, and to an extent the queen. So generally speaking, especially if you're playing white, there's always exceptions, but the D and E pawns, we're going to want to move them early. Exception might be the fianchetto openings, and that's where you would move forward your B or G pawn one square and put the bishop on the gap that's been created. So for example, white will frequently play G3 and then bishop to G2, the fianchetto. But even then, the bishop is still pointing at the center, so there's some logic to it. So it's controlling the center. Generally, you're going to develop your knights towards the center, not the edges. So the knight from B1 for white is usually going to want to be on C3 or D2 rather than A3. The knight on G1, you're usually going to put it on F3, occasionally E2. And the same for the black knights from B8 and G8, that we're not going to, as a general rule, we're not going to want to put them on the A and H files. Again, there's the occasional exception, there always is, but this is general principles. Develop the knights towards the center. Again, classical chess, a principle that generally you're going to develop your knights before the bishop that's next to it. So you'll probably find that most of the time white will move the knight on G1 before moving the bishop that's on F1, for example, and similar from black. I mean, but knights before bishops is a general principle of classical chess. Lots of there's exceptions, of course. There's exceptions like the London system, D4, D5, bishop F4, or the bishop's game E4, E5, bishop C4. But most of the most common openings, most successful ones, the knights go slightly first. Get castled one side or other as soon as you can. Nearly always a good idea to get castled as early as you can and get your king safe in a corner. It's dangerous having your king stuck in the middle of the board, and in any case, in the early stages of the game, it's just in the way. You don't want your king on the back rank getting in the way of your two rooks moving side to side, threatening things from range. So generally speaking, you're going to get castled as soon as you can. Don't ignore the center of the board. So if you can put pawns in it, that's great. But even if you can't, try to be able to attack it from the sides. So whether that means putting your bishops on G2 and B2, or one of G2 and B2 if you're white, or G7, B7 if you're black. But do something that at least attacks and gets involved in the center of the board. Trying not to move the same piece several times in the opening. Again, there's the odd exception, like in the Roy Lopez, you might find that your F1 bishop as white gets moved a few times, but it's okay because each time it's improving the position. But generally, we don't want to keep moving the same piece time and time again because it's just wasting time. Similarly, trying to avoid making too many pawn moves before your pieces are developed. Yeah, probably 3 or 4 pawn moves is about right to get you through the opening. As always, I'm going to say it every time. There's the odd exception now and again. But try to avoid too many pawn moves, and especially try to avoid moving the pawns that are where you intend to castle your king. So if you're going to castle king side, you don't want to be shoving the F, G and H pawns forward willy-nilly, because that means your king will be castling with no protection in front of him. And the other one, again, it's usually a good idea not to bring the queen out to the middle of the board too early. What will happen is she'll just get pestered by enemy pieces. So you'll find the enemy knights and bishops will try to will try to develop at the same time as attacking your queen if you bring her out too early. And you have to waste time then moving her out of the attack, which just loses time, just is giving the enemy time at your expense. So here's an example of an appalling opening. I can't remember, it was a long time ago when I wrote the PowerPoints. I can't remember how bad it was, but I'm sure it was awful. Press pause if you want to play the moves on a board. And with a bit of luck, you would have got a position that looks something like that. And what you can see here is that white has opened the game, sensibly developed pieces. One bishop still to move and needs to castle, but white is pretty much ready for the middle game. Black's made 6 pawn moves, not developed a single piece, has moved the pawns from the front of his likely castled positions, and in a couple of the pawns' cases has even wasted time moving them twice. So you've got to say that white stands better here. And if it was black to move now, D6 would actually be a little bit of a pain for white because there's nowhere to put the knight. But you get the idea here. Just looking at the board tells you that white stands just better in this position, or this kind of position anyway. Let's see this time white having a shocker. So again, press pause if you just want to quickly play the moves on a board, and we'll see what white's done here that's so awful. And hopefully if you paused it, you've got something that looks like this. So what's happened? White hasn't bothered to do anything particular in the center of the board. Instead has just created pretty patterns with the knight. So knight h3, d5, f3, e5, knight f2, knight f6, c3, bishop d6, and so on and so on. All white's doing is just creating these pretty patterns that beginners especially really like doing this, just moving a pawn forward and then putting a piece in the gap and all this instead of developing pieces. And it should be pretty clear that black is already far, far better in that position. So I mentioned earlier something that I call at Chess Club the diagonal of death, and it's to do with the weakest squares on the board. So F2 for white and F7 for black. And you need to watch those squares and the diagonals that they sit on, because those two squares are only protected by the king. And what that means is that if two or more pieces are attacking those squares at once, the king is in deep trouble. And so let's have a look at an example. So after the moves e4, e5, bishop c4, knight c6, and queen h5, which actually isn't a particularly good move, black should just play g6. And what did I say about kicking the white queen for coming out too early? But if black is careless and just plays knight f6, queen takes f7, is taken advantage of the diagonal of death from h5 to e8 and that weak f7 square. And that's the 4-move checkmate. So you have to be very, very careful. This one here comes around after white, again, ignores the center of the board. f4 actually isn't the worst opening move, as long as you don't follow it up with g4. So f4, e6 from black, g4 with as many question marks as you want to give it, and queen h4 is checkmate. This time the diagonal of death against the white king and this f2 square, and no way to escape mate. And that's the quickest possible game of chess. And it can obviously come about if white's played f3 as well. So be careful of the diagonal that has the f7 square on it, especially that one, but also the one that I'm just indicating now, and I'll do it on the other board. Be careful of the crossfire of these squares in the opening, because f2 and f7 are very, very, very weak squares if you don't keep an eye on them. Okay, so it says over to you to play some games, and absolutely that's correct. If you follow the general principles, you should be able to get to something in the middle game that's playable, even if you don't really know the names and things of the openings you're playing. But center pawns, knights, bishops, get castled. If you do that, you're very rarely going to go too badly wrong in chess.